The smoke hung low over the valley like a burial shroud, thick and acrid, clinging to the bent prairie grass and curling through the charred skeleton of what had been home. Wakiza sat motionless on the splintered bench outside his ruined cabin, the only piece of furniture left standing, his fists clenched so tight the knuckles had split and bled. He was a Cheyenne warrior in his early 30s, lean and weathered by years of forced marches and broken treaties, his face carved by wind and hardship into something both beautiful and terrible. His breath came shallow and ragged, each inhale tasting of ash and kerosene. The rage inside him was a living thing coiled tight in his chest, like a rattlesnake ready to strike. The homestead along Storm Creek had been his attempt at permanence filed through proxy by Dr. Jules Moreau, filed under the Indian Homestead Provisions of 1875 on Wakiza's behalf, pending citizenship or guardianship paperwork, making the claim lawful under territorial practice at the time. Jules Moreau to navigate the legal barriers that kept native people from owning land. Now it was nothing but blackened timber and shattered dreams. The fire had started at the feed shed. He could read the burn pattern like tracking signs, the way the flames had raced along a deliberate trail of kerosene to the roof, consuming everything with methodical efficiency. This was no accident. This was murder by flame, calculated and cold. His eyes settled on the corral posts, each one branded with fresh RR marks. Ruby Mesa Cattle Company. Roman Rusk's signature as clear as a confession written in soot and blood. But there was more. 3 arrow shafts stood hammered into the posts, their fletching designed to look Cheyenne, but wrong in every detail, too uniform, too new the dye chemical, instead of natural. A frame job crude enough to insult him, but effective enough to convince a territorial judge or liquored-up posse that the savage had torched his own place. The bitter irony of it made his jaw ache with suppressed fury. Wakiza rose slowly, every muscle coiled tight with barely restrained violence. He retrieved his bow from where it leaned against the bench. The weapon was old, its wood smoothed by a decade of use, worn by his father's hands before his own. But the sinew string was fresh and strong. He nocked an arrow by instinct, scanning the ridgeline, with eyes that had learned long ago to see death before it arrived. Then he heard it, a weak, wet cough from the creek bed below. He moved fast, sliding down the muddy bank in a controlled descent boots, finding purchase on exposed roots. The willows were thick at the water's edge, their branches tangled and heavy with soot. He pushed through them and froze. A woman lay half submerged in the shallow current, her dress blackened and torn face smeared with ash that couldn't hide the pallor beneath. She was young, mid-20s, with dark hair matted against her skull and eyes that flickered open as he approached, eyes that held equal parts terror and defiance. She clutched a tin box to her chest with both hands, knuckles bone white from effort, as if letting go would mean surrendering her soul. Her breathing was labored, each inhale a ragged scrape that spoke of smoke-damaged lungs, and her left ankle twisted at an angle that made his stomach clench. He knelt beside her, setting the bow within reach. "Who are you?" "Celine," she managed, voice raw from smoke and pain. "School teacher, Prairie Dawn." He recognized the name. She taught at the one-room schoolhouse 5 miles east, where some Cheyenne children went when families could spare them. He'd seen her once in town, carrying an impossible stack of books, walking alone with the determined stride of someone who refused to be diminished by frontier isolation. An Eastern transplant, unmarried, which made her an oddity in territory where women were scarce, and marriage often meant the difference between survival and starvation. "What are you doing here?" "Came to warn you." She coughed, her whole body convulsing with the effort, and when she opened her eyes again, they were wet with unshed tears, whether from pain or grief, he couldn't tell. "Rusk's men, they burned it. They're coming back to make sure there are no witnesses." As if summoned by her words, The sound of hoofbeats echoed across the valley. Distant but closing fast, the heavy rhythm of riders pushing their mounts hard. Wakiza's head snapped up, hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. He scanned the ridge and saw dust rising against gray sky like a warning flag. 4 riders. "They know I saw," Celine whispered. And for the first time, he heard something in her voice that went beyond fear. It was the exhaustion of someone who'd been running too long, who'd glimpsed the abyss and found it staring back. "They know I took the ledger." Wakiza didn't hesitate. He tore a strip of buckskin from his vest, the leather still warm from his body, and wrapped it around her ankle in a tight figure 8, working with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd set bones in worse conditions. She bit her lip bloody to keep from crying out. And he found himself oddly moved by her refusal to show weakness. When the binding was secure, he shifted position, pulling her deeper into the willow shadows and positioning his body over hers, one knee braced on the bank, his back to the creek. The riders crested the ridge. 4 silhouettes against smoke-stained sky, dark and menacing as apocalypse horsemen. Wakiza recognized the lead rider's bulk. Mercer Rusk's foreman, a man whose reputation for cruelty stretched from Wyoming to Colorado like a trail of blood. The others fanned out with military precision, their voices carrying on the wind. "Check the creek," Mercer barked. "She went down this way. Find her or don't come back." Wakiza pressed Celine lower his hand, firm on her shoulder. Her breath was warm against his ribs, heart pounding so hard he could feel it through layers of cloth, a frantic drumbeat that matched his own. He kept his breathing slow and controlled, willing the shadows to hold them, willing his presence to become nothing more than stone and water. One man dismounted, boots crunching gravel as he approached the bank. Wakiza's fingers curled around a smooth river stone, his thumb testing its weight and balance. The rider leaned over the edge, scanning the water with eyes that saw nothing but what they expected to see. His hand rested casual on his revolver fingers, drumming an impatient rhythm against the grip. Wakiza didn't move, didn't breathe. The willows shielded them, barely a curtain of green between life and death. If the man looked down, if he took one more step, if the angle of light shifted even slightly. The rider spat a thick glob of tobacco juice into the creek and turned away. "Nothing here." Mercer's voice was sharp with frustration. "Keep looking. She's bleeding. There'll be tracks. And she's got the ledger. Rusk wants it back more than he wants her dead." The tin box. Wakiza's gaze dropped to it, still clutched against Celine's chest like a lifeline. Whatever was inside had gotten her into this nightmare, and now it was pulling him in too, dragging him into a fight he hadn't asked for but couldn't walk away from. The riders moved along the ridge, voices fading as they spread out to search. Wakiza waited until the hoofbeats were distant echoes, then pulled Celine to her feet in one smooth motion. She swayed all her weight on her good leg, and he steadied her with a hand at her waist, feeling the tremor in her muscles, the way she fought to stay upright through sheer force of will. Their eyes met in the dappled shadow of the willows. Hers were dark and fierce, filled with pain, but also with a determination that reminded him of warriors he'd known, people who'd stared down death and refused to blink. In that moment, something passed between them, unspoken but real. A recognition. A spark of understanding that survival meant trusting this stranger completely, and that trust was a dangerous, fragile thing. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice low and careful. "I don't have a choice," she said, and he heard the steel beneath the exhaustion. He nodded, once adjusted his bow across his back, and turned upstream. "Stay close. Make no sound. If they catch us, they'll kill us both, but they'll take their time with you." He didn't say it to frighten her. He said it because she deserved the truth and because he suspected she already knew. Celine limped after him, the tin box pressed tight against her side, and together they disappeared into deeper shadows, leaving only faint footprints in mud and the distant echo of hooves across burned prairie. The creek wound through a narrow channel, carved over centuries of spring, run off its banks lined with cottonwoods and willows that offered cover but also concealed danger in every shadow. Waukeeza moved with the practiced silence of a predator, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain ahead, while his ears tracked every sound behind them. And the distant call of riders, the rustle of wind through grass, the nervous chatter of birds disturbed by human passage. He kept Celine close, his hand occasionally reaching back to steady her when the ground turned treacherous with exposed roots and slick stones. She didn't complain, though he could see the pain etched deep into her face. With every step could hear the way her breath came in short, controlled gasps as she fought to keep moving. Her ankle was swelling badly against the buckskin, binding the joint inflamed and angry, and he knew that every mile they covered was bringing her closer to the point where the leg would simply give out. But stopping wasn't an option. Not yet. They reached a bend where the creek widened into a shallow basin, the water pooling clear and cold before continuing its journey downstream. Waukeeza stopped crouching low behind a fallen cottonwood and gestured for Celine to do the same. She sank down beside him with a barely suppressed whimper, her legs folding awkwardly, and he caught her before she could pitch forward into the water. "Rest," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the burble of the creek. But only for a moment. She nodded, chest heaving with the effort of drawing breath, and clutched the tin box tighter as if it were the only solid thing in a world gone to chaos. Waukeeza studied her for a long moment, noting the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she refused to meet his eyes, because she knew if she did, the tears she'd been holding back might finally break free. Then he reached out and gently pried her fingers loose from the box. She resisted at first, eyes flashing with alarm and something that looked almost like betrayal. But he met her gaze steadily, his expression calm and patient. "I need to see what's worth dying for," he said simply. After a heartbeat of hesitation, she let go. Her hands trembled as they fell away, and he realized she'd been holding that box so tightly her palms were blistered and bleeding. Waukeeza opened the tin box with careful reverence. The hinges creaked softly in the stillness. Inside were several sheets of paper, some folded with precise creases, some flat and wrinkled from moisture. All were covered in neat, methodical handwriting, the kind of penmanship that spoke of education and discipline. He recognized the format ledger entries copied in carbon. The dates ranged over the past 6 months, and the numbers told a story of cattle purchases, payroll disbursements, land transactions conducted with cold efficiency. But it was the margin annotations that made his blood run cold. Storm Creek diversion approved. County recorder paid $200. Deputy Frank bonus for cooperation. And then, in a different hand, scrawled hastily, as if added later, Steel Mountain survey compensation pending tribal clearance. Steel Mountain. The name meant nothing to him yet, but the word tribal clearance made his stomach clench with sick recognition. He'd heard those words before, whispered in treaty councils and government offices, bureaucratic language that meant displacement, forced relocation, erasure. "Rusk is stealing the water." Celine said, her voice steadier now that she'd caught her breath. She shifted closer to him, pointing to specific entries with a trembling finger. "He's filing false claims on Storm Creek Spring, claiming it's on his land when it's not. The spring feeds the entire valley. Without it, the smallholders can't water their crops or cattle. They'll have to sell or abandon their homesteads, and Rusk will buy the land for nothing." Waukeeza's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. He'd filed his own homestead claim through Dr. Jules Moreau, a French physician who'd helped him navigate the labyrinthine territorial laws designed to keep men like him from owning land. The claim was legal, properly recorded, stamped with official seals. But it meant nothing if Rusk could steal the water and starve him out. The cabin burning was step 1. The arrow frame-up was step 2. If Rusk could paint him as a threat, a savage reverting to violence, the territorial authorities would finish the job and no one would question it. "Why were you there?" Waukeeza asked, his eyes still on the papers, committing every detail to memory. Celine took a shaky breath. "I do bookkeeping for Ruby Ridge. Part-time to supplement my teaching salary. The work is dull, but it pays better than the territorial school board ever could." Her voice dropped, becoming almost confessional. "I overheard Rusk and Mercer discussing the diversion 3 weeks ago. They were planning to blast a new channel with black powder, reroute the spring behind barbed wire post guards to keep people away. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't have proof. So I waited. I watched. And when Rusk met with the county recorder last week, I copied what I could from the ledger while his office was empty." She paused, swallowing hard. He caught me before I could finish. Not in the act, I was too careful for that, but he must have suspected. He had Mercer follow me. I barely made it out of town. I rode straight to your place to warn you, because I knew you'd be next. The homesteads along the creek are the only thing standing between Rusk and total control of the water. But I was too late. Her voice cracked on the last word, and this time the tears did come silent and accusing. I was too late, and they burned your home because of me. Waukeeza closed the box carefully and handed it back to her. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and he felt the tremor running through her, not just fear, but guilt, sharp and corrosive. They burned my home, because Rusk is greedy, and I'm in his way. Waukeeza said, his voice low and firm. You tried to stop it. That's more than most would do. I should have done more, faster. You did what you could. He stood scanning the ridgeline again. Now we do what we must. He dipped his hand into the creek, testing the temperature. The water was cold snowmelt from the high country, and he cupped it carefully in his palm. He brought it to her lips, steadying her chin with his other hand, a gesture of surprising gentleness from a man who'd spent his life learning to survive, through hardness. She drank gratefully, her eyes closing briefly, and he found himself watching the way her throat moved as she swallowed, the way damp strands of hair clung to her cheek like dark calligraphy against pale skin. When she opened her eyes again, their faces were inches apart, close enough that he could see flecks of gold in her dark irises, could feel the warmth of her breath mingling with his in the cooling air. For a suspended moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them. The distant threat of riders, the ruined cabin, the uncertain future, all of it faded into background noise. There was only this, the intimacy of survival, the strange and terrible alchemy that turned strangers into allies. Celine's hand came up almost unconsciously and rested on his forearm. Her fingers were cold and trembling, but the touch sent a jolt through him that had nothing to do with temperature. He looked at those fingers, small, delicate, stained with ink from years of teaching, and felt something shift in his chest. Something dangerous and unwelcome. Because caring about someone meant having something to lose, and he'd already lost too much. Thank you, she whispered. He nodded once, throat tight and pulled back. The spell broke and the world rushed back in with all its harsh edges and urgent demands. Then the sound of hoofbeats shattered the moment completely. Closer now, much closer. The riders had circled back, their search tightening like a noose. Waukeeza could hear Mercer's voice carrying on the wind, sharp with command and barely leashed violence. Check the creek again. She's injured, she can't have gone far. There'll be blood tracks, something. Find her, or I'll leave your bodies for the buzzards. Wakiza grabbed Celine's arm, his fingers digging in with urgent pressure. "We move, now." He pulled her to her feet and half-carried, half-dragged her deeper into the water. The cold bit at their legs, like teeth soaking through their clothes with shocking intensity. But it masked their scent and muffled their movements, and right now, that was all that mattered. He positioned her behind a fallen cottonwood, its massive root system exposed and tangled like the fingers of a buried giant, and crouched beside her, his body between hers and the approaching danger. A rider appeared on the bank above them, his silhouette dark and threatening against the dying light. Small Sam, one of Mercer's regulars, a wiry man with a reputation for casual cruelty and a tendency to brag about his kills in saloons. He knelt at the water's edge, scanning the creek bed with eyes that were too sharp, too careful. His hand rested on his revolver, fingers tapping an impatient rhythm. Wakiza's fingers closed around a smooth riverstone, half buried in the mud. Its surface was cold and slick, perfectly weighted. He held his breath, counting the seconds in his head, waiting for the precise moment when Sam's attention would shift downstream away from them. 1, 2, 3. Sam started to turn. Wakiza moved. The stone left his hand in a perfect arc and struck Sam in the temple with a sound like a hammer hitting wood. The man's eyes went wide with shock, then rolled back in his head. He crumpled forward, hands clutching at air, and toppled face first into the creek with a tremendous splash. Wakiza didn't wait to see if he'd killed him. He lunged up the bank, water streaming from his clothes, and grabbed Sam's revolver before it could sink into the current. The weapon was a Colt, well-maintained 6 rounds in the cylinder. Without hesitation, he aimed upstream and fired a single shot into the empty air. The sound echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, magnified and distorted. Shouts erupted from multiple directions. "There, downstream, move, move." Wakiza slid back down the bank, boots slipping on wet rock, and pulled Celine close. Her eyes were huge in her pale face, her breathing rapid and shallow on the edge of panic, but holding it together through sheer force of will. "Can you run?" he asked. "I don't know." "You have to." He hauled her up, and together they stumbled upstream, moving against the current, the cold water numbing their legs and making every step a battle. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder. Men crashing through brush horses, nickering and snorting, Mercer's voice rising above it all in furious command. But the false trail worked. The riders followed the gunshot, followed their expectations, and by the time they realized the deception, Wakiza and Celine were a quarter-mile upstream, crawling out onto the opposite bank in the deepening twilight. They collapsed together on the muddy ground, gasping for air, their bodies shaking uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion, and the aftermath of adrenaline. Wakiza's heart hammered against his ribs so hard it felt like it might crack bone. Beside him, Celine curled into a tight ball, arms wrapped around herself, teeth chattering so violently she couldn't speak. Without thinking, Wakiza stripped off his shirt. The fabric was soaked through heavy with creek water, but he wrung it out as best he could and then pulled Celine against his bare chest, wrapping the damp shirt around both of them like a shared blanket. She stiffened at first, her body going rigid with surprise and the ingrained propriety of her Eastern upbringing. But the cold was brutal, sinking into bones and marrow, and survival trumped modesty. Gradually, she relaxed into him, her cheek pressing against his collarbone, her breath warm against his skin. He could feel her heartbeat, rapid and fluttering like a trapped bird, in the way her whole body trembled with each inhale. His arm came around her waist, holding her steady, and he felt the exact moment when she stopped fighting and simply surrendered to the necessity of shared warmth. Her fingers curled into the fabric at his waist, clinging, and he tightened his hold in response, a wordless promise that he wouldn't let go, wouldn't let her fall. They stayed like that for a long time, huddled together in the gathering dark, listening to the distant shouts of their pursuers and the eternal song of the creek. Neither spoke. Words would have been inadequate, insufficient to capture the strangeness of this intimacy, the way danger stripped away pretense and left only the essential truth that they were alive. They were together, and for now, that was enough. Eventually, the shouts faded. The riders moved on, searching in the wrong direction, and the night settled over the valley like a benediction. Waukeeza finally spoke, his voice low and rough. "We need to keep moving. Find shelter before full dark." Celine nodded against his chest, but didn't immediately pull away. When she finally did, her eyes met his in the dim light, and he saw something there that made his breath catch, not just gratitude, but recognition, understanding. The acknowledgement that something had shifted between them, that they were no longer just two people thrown together by circumstance. They were bound now, for better or worse. And as they rose and continued upstream through the darkness, Waukeeza found himself thinking not just about survival, but about what might come after, if there was an after, if they lived long enough to see it. The thought was both terrifying and strangely, impossibly hopeful. They moved through twilight, following a cattle path that wound along the valley edge toward Henrik Larsson's homestead. Henrik was a Swedish immigrant who scratched out a meager living on a few acres of marginal grazing land, his face weathered by sun and hardship into something resembling old leather. Waukeeza knew him by reputation, a decent man, stubborn and proud, who owed Rusk nothing, and would likely be nursing his own grievances against the cattle baron. The path was treacherous, churned into thick gumbo mud by recent rain and cattle hooves. Celine struggled with every step, her face gone gray with pain and exhaustion. Waukeeza watched her catch herself stumble again, and finally he simply stopped and lifted her into his arms without asking permission. "I can walk," she protested weakly. "Not fast enough." His voice was matter-of-fact but gentle. "Save your strength. You'll need it." She didn't argue further, just let her head rest against his shoulder with a sigh that was half relief, half surrender. He carried her like that for nearly a mile, and despite the burning in his arms and the protest of his own exhausted muscles, he found he didn't mind. There was something right about it, protecting her, bearing her burden. It awakened something in him he thought long dead, something that went beyond duty or alliance, into territory he wasn't ready to name. The sky overhead darkened from purple to indigo, the first stars emerging like distant campfires. Storm clouds gathered on the western horizon, their bellies swollen with rain, and the wind picked up, carrying the electric smell of approaching weather. Waukeeza felt the shift in air pressure and knew they had maybe 20 minutes before the storm hit. They reached Henrik's farmhouse just as the first fat drops began to fall. The place was modest to the point of poverty, a single-story structure with a sagging porch, a lean-to stable attached to one side. A milk cow lowed mournfully in the small corral, and thin smoke rose from the chimney. Waukeeza carried Celine to the stable, away from the house, not wanting to compromise Henrik's safety. He eased her down onto a pile of straw, and she collapsed with a sound that was half sob, half sigh. "Wait here," he said, his hand briefly touching her shoulder, a gesture that was becoming familiar, natural. "I'll get the horse." Her fingers caught his wrist. What if they're already here? They're not. He covered her hand with his squeezing. The gesture was meant to be reassuring, but it lingered a heartbeat too long, his thumb unconsciously stroking the inside of her wrist, where her pulse beat rapid and fragile. Not yet. Their eyes held in the dim light of the stable, and something passed between them again, that same electric current, that same dangerous connection. Then Waukeeza pulled away and slipped deeper into the stable. The bay mare was there, standing patient in her stall. Waukeeza approached slowly, murmuring in Cheyenne words of reassurance and respect. The mare's ears flicked toward him, and she allowed him to check her over, to unbridle her with careful hands. He was working the leather straps when he heard it. Hoofbeats, multiple riders approaching fast. His heart sank. They'd been found. He grabbed a hay hook from the wall, a wicked curved blade, and positioned himself behind the door. Across the stable, Celine had gone perfectly still. The tin box clutched to her chest, her eyes huge with fear, but also with trust. Trust in him. The weight of it was almost crushing. The stable door crashed open. Greasewood filled the doorway, his bulk blocking the light. Rain dripped from his hat, and his hand rested on his revolver. "Henrik," he called out. "I know you're hiding something. Best you hand it over now." He took a step toward the stall. Wakiza moved like lightning. He hooked the hay hook into Greasewood's gun belt and yanked with all his strength. The man stumbled backward with a curse, and at that exact moment the mare, already spooked, reared up. Her hooves came down like hammers, catching Greasewood square in the chest. The sound was sickening bone and meat and expelled air. He flew backward into the water trough with a splash that sent water sheeting across the floor. Wakiza didn't wait. He grabbed the mare, spoke quick words to calm her, and led her out. Celine was already moving, despite her pain, the tin box hidden deep in her undergarments. She stumbled deliberately as she passed a theatrical gasp that drew the attention of the other riders rushing toward the commotion. Wakiza lifted her onto the mare's back and vaulted up behind her, his arms coming around her to grab the reins. At that moment, Henrik appeared in his doorway with a pitchfork, and Wakiza saw the older man make his choice. Saw him step into the path of the riders, saw him kick a feed barrel to block their way. No strangers here. Henrik said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd drawn his line. "Get off my land." Those seconds were enough. Wakiza spurred the mare forward, and they galloped across the muddy pasture and into the scrub just as the storm broke. Rain came down in sheets, turning the world into a gray blur. The wind howled, and Wakiza leaned low over the mare's neck, one arm locked around Celine. She shivered violently against him, her body convulsing with cold that went beyond discomfort into genuine danger. He fumbled for his blanket, draped it over her, and then bound her hands to the saddle horn tight enough that even if she lost consciousness, she wouldn't fall. She didn't protest, couldn't protest, and he took her silence as trust. They rode through darkness and storm, following the creek by instinct and memory. Lightning cracked overhead, thunder rolling like artillery. Once, when lightning illuminated the world in stark white, Wakiza looked down and saw Celine's face pale as death eyes closed, her whole body slumped against him. Terror gripped his chest. He pressed his fingers to her throat, feeling for a pulse, and found it rapid, but there. "Stay with me," he said urgently into her ear. "Celine, stay with me. Don't you quit on me now." Her eyes flickered open for just a moment, and he saw recognition there. A ghost of a nod. When they finally reached Outlaw Pass, the storm had eased to steady rain. Wakiza guided the exhausted mare to Dr. Moreau's clinic, slid off, and lifted Celine down. She was barely conscious, her body limp and unresponsive. He carried her up the steps and kicked the door open. Dr. Jules Moreau looked up from his desk, and whatever he'd been about to say died on his lips. He saw them soaked, bloodied Celine unconscious, and his expression shifted to professional calm. "Set her down," Moreau said, already clearing his examination table. "Quickly, tell me everything while I work." Wakiza laid Celine down gently, then stepped back and began to talk. The words came in a rush: the burned cabin, the frame-up, the ledger, the pursuit, Henrik's farm, the storm. Moreau listened while his hands moved with practiced efficiency, cutting away wet clothes, checking pulse and breathing, examining the swollen ankle. When Wakiza finished, there was a long silence, broken only by rain against windows and Celine's shallow breathing. "This is worse than I thought," Moreau said quietly. Much worse. Rusk isn't just stealing water, he's trying to eliminate anyone who stands in his way. Dr. Moreau worked through the night. He set Celine's ankle with splints and bandages, administered laudanum for the pain, and wrapped her in warm blankets to combat the hypothermia. By dawn, her color had improved, and her breathing had steadied into the rhythm of deep, healing sleep. Waukeeza sat in a chair by the window, unable to rest despite his exhaustion. His body ached in a dozen places, his clothes were still damp and filthy, and the cut on his scalp throbbed with every heartbeat. But he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flames consuming his cabin. Saw Celine's pale face in the lightning flash, saw the future stretching out, dark and uncertain. Moreau brought him coffee and a plate of bread and cheese. Eat. You're no good to anyone if you collapse. Waukeeza ate mechanically, tasting nothing. How is she? She'll live. The ankle will heal, though she'll need to stay off it for weeks. The smoke damage to her lungs is concerning, but she's young and strong. Moreau paused. You got her here just in time. Another hour in that storm, and... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Waukeeza looked at Celine sleeping peacefully now, her face relaxed in a way he hadn't seen since he'd found her in the creek. Something in his chest tightened painfully. He'd known her less than a day, and yet the thought of losing her, of arriving too late, of failing to protect her, was unbearable. When had that happened? When had she become more than just an ally, more than just a witness he needed to keep alive? Tell me about the ledger, Moreau said, pulling up a chair. Waukeeza retrieved the tin box from where Celine had left it and handed it over. Moreau examined the papers with growing concern, his expression darkening with each page. This is explosive, he said finally. Rusk has been bribing county officials, falsifying water claims. If this gets to U.S. Marshal Pike, it will destroy him. But... He paused. It's incomplete. The signatures are missing the county recorder's final approval, the judge's seal. Without those, a good lawyer could argue these are forgeries or misinterpretations. Then we need the full ledger, Waukeeza said, which is in Rusk's office at Ruby Ridge Stockade, guarded by Mercer and an army of hired guns. Moreau shook his head. It's suicide. Maybe. But what's the alternative? Let Rusk steal the water drive out, the small holders take everything. Waukeeza's voice was quiet, but edged with steel. I've spent my life watching my people lose everything: land, water, dignity. Treaties broken, promises forgotten. I won't let it happen again. Not here. Not while I can still fight. Moreau studied him for a long moment. You're not just fighting for the land anymore, are you? Waukeeza's eyes flicked to Celine, still sleeping peacefully. No, he admitted. Not just the land. Moreau nodded slowly. Then we'll need a plan, a good one, and we'll need help. He pulled out a telegram that had arrived the previous night. This is from Quiet Quentin at the telegraph office. Pike had already staged a small detail in the district after multiple water rights complaints. Moreau's midnight wire simply gave him cause to move at once. He's willing to send a message to Marshal Pike in Dry River. The problem is the wire beyond Echo Canyon keeps getting cut, Rusk's line riders. Even if we get a message through, it will take days for Pike to respond. Then we send it anyway, Waukeeza said. And we buy ourselves time. How? We go to Ruby Ridge. We get that ledger, and we make sure Rusk can't cover his tracks. Moreau was quiet for a moment, then nodded. I'll rally what support I can. Henrik and the other small holders, they've all suffered under Rusk's control. If we can create a distraction, draw his men away from the stockade, then we might have a chance. They spent the morning planning spreading maps on Moreau's desk, marking guard positions and patrol routes that Waukeeza had observed during his infrequent trips past Ruby Ridge. It was a desperate plan full of holes and uncertainty, but it was the only plan they had. Around noon, Celine stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpening as she took in her surroundings. When she saw Waukeeza sitting by the window, something in her expression softened. "You're still here," she said, her voice hoarse. "Where else would I be?" She smiled faintly. Sensible men would have run by now. "Then I suppose I'm not sensible." She tried to sit up, winced at the pain in her ankle, and Waukeeza was at her side in an instant, his hands gentle as he helped her adjust the pillows. "Easy," he said. "You need to rest." "I've rested enough." She looked at the papers spread on Moreau's desk, at the grim expressions on both men's faces. "What's the plan?" Moreau explained, and as he spoke, Celine's expression grew more determined. When he finished, she nodded once. "I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not," Waukeeza said immediately. "You can barely walk." "I know Rusk's office. I know where he keeps things, how the safe works. You need me. What I need is for you to be safe." Their eyes locked, the air between them crackled with sudden tension. It was Celine who broke the silence. "I didn't risk everything just to hide while you finish this," she said quietly. "This is my fight too, my choice. You don't get to take that away from me." Waukeeza wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that he couldn't bear the thought of her in danger again, and that the fear he'd felt carrying her through the storm had nearly broken him. But he saw the steel in her eyes, the same determination that had kept her moving when her body wanted to quit, and he knew she wouldn't back down. "Fine," he said finally. "But you stay close to me. Always." "Always." She agreed. The word felt like a promise that went beyond the immediate danger. That night, under cover of darkness, they made their move. Moreau had rallied Henrik and 3 other smallholders, men and women, who'd suffered under Rusk's greed and were ready to fight back. The plan was simple. Create a distraction at the eastern fence line of Ruby Ridge, draw the guards away, and give Waukeeza and Celine a chance to slip inside. The distraction worked beautifully. A hay wagon went up in flames with a roar that could be heard for miles, black smoke billowing into the sky. Guards rushed from all directions to contain it, shouting orders and scrambling for water buckets. In the chaos, Waukeeza and Celine crossed the shallow arroyo, cut through the barbed wire with borrowed pliers, and slipped into the compound. Waukeeza had fashioned a makeshift crutch for Celine from a broken fence post, and she moved with surprising speed despite her injury, her face set in determined lines. They reached the office building, and Waukeeza boosted her up to the porch roof, then climbed up after her. They slipped through a broken shutter into a narrow hallway, moving quickly toward Rusk's office. The door was locked. Waukeeza picked it with a bent nail, a skill he'd learned years ago from a trader who'd taken pity on a hungry Cheyenne boy, and the door swung open. Inside the office was cluttered with papers, maps, and the detritus of a man who believed himself untouchable. A large safe sat in the corner. "That's it," Celine whispered, moving toward it. "I watched him open it once. I think I remember the combination." She knelt in front of the safe, her fingers trembling slightly as she worked the dial. Waukeeza stood guard at the door, his stolen revolver in hand, every nerve on high alert. The lock clicked. The door swung open. Inside were stacks of cash land deeds, legal documents. But there, buried beneath everything else, was what they'd come for. A thick, leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with years of transactions, bribes, and schemes. Wakiza grabbed it along with a bundle of telegrams and receipts. But as he was about to close the safe, something caught his eye. A rolled map tied with string tucked in the back corner and partially hidden by a false panel. Something about it made his skin crawl. He pulled it out and unrolled it on the desk. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. The map showed the valley in meticulous detail, with Storm Creek marked in blue ink. But overlaid on the map was a new route, a railroad spur line, cutting through the heart of Cheyenne territory, crossing the creek and continuing east toward Steel Mountain. Annotations in Rusk's handwriting marked key locations, depot site approved. Water access guaranteed. Steel Mountain compensation $50,000. And then in red ink circled and underlined, tribal relocation mandatory. Federal approval pending final survey, clearance by force if necessary. Wakiza's hands shook as he stared at the map. It wasn't just about water. It wasn't just about driving out small holders. Rusk was planning to remove the Cheyenne entirely to force them off land they'd been promised, land they'd fought to keep. The cabin burning, the frame up, the water theft, it was all part of a larger conspiracy to clear the valley for the railroad. And Rusk had been planning it for months, maybe years. The rage that filled Wakiza was unlike anything he'd ever felt. It was cold and vast, a fury that went beyond personal grievance into something primal. They weren't just trying to take his home. They were trying to erase his people. Again. "What is it?" Celine whispered, moving to his side. He couldn't speak. His throat was too tight, his chest constricting with a grief so profound it felt like drowning. He pointed to the annotations with a shaking hand. Celine read them, and her face went pale. "They're going to remove your people," she breathed, "to make way for the railroad. That's what tribal clearance meant in the ledger. That's what Steel Mountain is paying for." "Not just remove," Wakiza managed his voice rough. "Erase. Like we were never here. Like we don't matter." Celine's hand found his arm, gripping tight. "We'll stop them. We'll get this to Marshal Pike. We'll make sure everyone knows what Rusk is planning." Wakiza looked at her, at this woman who'd risked everything to expose corruption, who'd been injured and hunted and nearly killed, who had no reason to care about the fate of a displaced Cheyenne warrior and his people. And yet she did care. Fiercely. Completely. In that moment, something broke open inside him. The walls he'd built around his heart and the defenses he'd erected to survive loss after loss, they crumbled. And what rushed in to fill the space was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. He cared about her, not just as an ally, not just as someone he needed to protect. He cared about her in a way that made everything else, the danger, the mission, even his own survival, secondary. "Celine," he started to say, but the words died as footsteps echoed in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate, getting closer. Wakiza grabbed the map and ledger, shoving them into a canvas sack. "Move, now." They rushed toward the window, but before they could reach it, the door burst open. Mercer stood in the doorway, his revolver already drawn, his face twisted with rage and something that looked like satisfaction. "Going somewhere." Wakiza shoved Celine toward the window. "Go," Mercer fired. The bullet whipped past Wakiza's head so close he felt the heat of it, and wood exploded from the doorframe. Wakiza returned fire, his shot going wide, but forcing Mercer to duck, and in that heartbeat of time, Celine scrambled onto the porch roof. Wakiza followed Mercer's curses and footsteps pounding behind him. They ran across the roof, and when they reached the edge, there was no time to think, no time to plan. Wakiza grabbed Celine's hand and jumped. They fell together, hitting the rain barrel below with a splash and a crash that drove the air from Wakiza's lungs. They rolled into the mud, and Celine cried out as her ankle took the impact, but Wakiza was already pulling her up his arm around her waist, half carrying her as they ran for the fence line. Behind them, shouts erupted. Guards poured out of the compound and gunfire split the night. Bullets kicked up dirt around their feet, whined past their heads. Wakiza felt one tug at his sleeve, felt the burn as it grazed his arm. But he didn't slow down. They made it to the fence, squeezed through the gap they'd cut, and stumbled into the arroyo. Moreau and Henrik were there with horses, and Wakiza lifted Celine onto one, then vaulted up behind her. They galloped into the darkness, the sack with the ledger and map clutched tight, gunfire and curses fading behind them. They'd done it. They'd gotten the evidence. But the fight was far from over. They rendezvoused at the ravine where they'd first made camp, and Moreau examined the ledger and map by lamplight. His expression grew grimmer with each page. "This is everything we need," he said finally. "Proof of the bribes, the water theft, and the tribal relocation plan. With this, Marshal Pike can bring federal charges. Rusk won't just lose his empire, he'll spend the rest of his life in prison. If we can get it to Pike," Wakiza said, "Rusk knows we have it now. He'll mobilize every gun he has to stop us. Then we need to move fast." Moreau pulled out a map of the territory. "The telegraph relay at Echo Canyon is our best bet. It's isolated, but the line runs directly to Dry River. If we can transmit the key evidence, Pike will have enough to act." "How far?" Celine asked. 6 hours hard ride. Through terrain Rusk's men know better than we do." "Then we leave at first light," Wakiza said. But Moreau shook his head. "There's more. I rode past Storm Creek this afternoon. Rusk's men have built a crude dam, earth and timber reinforced with sandbags. They're using black powder to blast a new channel, rerouting the spring permanently. If they finish, the valley will be completely dry within a week. Every small holder will be forced to sell or abandon their land." Wakiza's jaw tightened. "When?" "Tomorrow, maybe the day after. They're working around the clock." A heavy silence fell over the group. Getting the evidence to Pike was crucial, but it would take days for the marshal to mobilize and arrive. By then, the dam would be finished, the water diverted, the damage done. "We have to stop the dam," Wakiza said. "Now, tonight." "That's suicide," Henrik protested. "Mercer will have guards posted. You'll never get close." "Then we'll have to be smarter than them." Wakiza looked at the faces around the fire. Ordinary people pushed to extraordinary action. "We've come this far. We can't quit now." Celine's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers lacing through his. "Together," she said quietly. Together, he agreed, and the word felt like a vow. They spent the next hour planning. Moreau would take the ledger and map to the Echo Canyon relay and transmit the evidence to Pike. Henrik and the other small holders would create diversions, draw off as many guards as possible. Wakiza and Celine would infiltrate the dam site and sabotage the diversion. It was desperate. It was dangerous. But it was their only chance. As the group dispersed to prepare, Celine pulled Wakiza aside. They stood at the edge of the ravine, the creek burbling below them, the stars overhead, indifferent and eternal. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "So am I." She looked up at him, surprise flickering across her face. "You don't seem scared." "I've learned to hide it, but I feel it all the same." He paused, then added quietly, "Especially now." "Why now?" "Because I have something to lose." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Celine's breath caught, and Wakiza found himself reaching up to cup her face with one hand, his thumb brushing her cheekbone in a gesture that was becoming achingly familiar. "If something happens to me tomorrow," he said, his voice rough, "if we don't both make it out." "Don't." She interrupted, her own hand coming up to cover his. "Don't say it. We're both going to make it. We have to. Celine. She rose up on her toes, ignoring the protest of her injured ankle, and kissed him. It was brief, almost chaste, but it carried the weight of everything they couldn't say. Fear, hope. The acknowledgement that something precious and fragile had grown between them, something worth fighting for, worth surviving for. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You don't get to say goodbye," she whispered. "Not yet. We finish this first. Together. And then." He prompted, his forehead resting against hers. "And then we figure out what comes next." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was too practical for that, too grounded in the uncertainty of their situation. But it was a promise, a commitment to try to see where this dangerous, unlikely connection might lead. If they survived. They reached the dam just before dawn. The structure loomed against the lightening sky, a crude earthwork reinforced with timber braces and sandbags, ugly and brutal in its efficiency. Guards patrolled the perimeter, and near the spillway men were laying fuses for another round of blasting. Kegs of black powder sat in neat rows, waiting to be deployed. Waukeeza and Celine moved through the scrub with painful slowness, every sound magnified in the pre-dawn quiet. Celine's ankle throbbed with each step, but she bit back her whimpers, her face set in determined lines. They reached a position overlooking the dam, hidden behind a jumble of boulders. Waukeeza counted at least 6 guards on horseback, maybe more working near the spillway. And there, supervising everything with his usual brutal efficiency, was Mercer. "Too many," Celine whispered. "We don't have to fight them. We just have to cut the fuses, move the powder kegs, and collapse the diversion. If we're smart." A shout cut him off. One of the guards had spotted movement in the scrub, Henrik and the others creating their diversion right on schedule. Immediately, 3 guards wheeled their horses and galloped toward the disturbance. That was their window. Waukeeza and Celine moved fast, keeping low, using every scrap of cover. They reached the base of the dam and began crawling along the packed earth, staying in the shadows. When they reached the spillway, Waukeeza pulled out his knife and began cutting fuses, hemp cords that would carry fire to the powder kegs. Celine worked beside him, her hands steady despite the tremor of fear running through her. They severed 3 fuses, 4, 5, hiding the cut ends under sandbags. Then a voice cut through the dawn like a whip crack. "Well, well, look what crawled out of the creek." Mercer stood 10 feet away, his revolver aimed directly at Waukeeza's head. Behind him, glass-eyed Joe emerged from the shadows, his rifle trained on Celine. Waukeeza's blood turned to ice. They'd been so focused on the fuses they hadn't heard the men approaching. A fatal mistake. "Drop the knife," Mercer ordered. "Slowly." Waukeeza let the knife fall into the mud. His mind raced, calculating distances, angles, odds. All of them bad. Mercer's smile was ugly. "You've been a thorn in Rusk's side long enough, Savage. Time to pluck you out." He gestured with his gun. "You schoolteacher, get over here." Celine didn't move. "Now," Mercer barked, "or I put a bullet in your friend's head and make you watch him die." Celine limped toward Mercer, her face pale but composed. When she was within reach, Mercer grabbed her by the hair and dragged her to the edge of the spillway, where water churned through the narrow channel. He held her over the drop, his arm around her throat. "The ledger," he said to Waukeeza. "Hand it over, or she goes in." Waukeeza's heart hammered. The ledger was back at the ravine with Moreau. But even if he had it, he knew Mercer would kill them both the moment he got what he wanted. "I don't have it," Waukeeza said. "We sent it to the territorial marshal. It's over, Mercer. Rusk is finished." Mercer's face twisted with rage. His arm tightened around Celine's throat, and she gasped, clawing at his arm. then you're both dead. Time seemed to slow. Wakiza saw Mercer's finger tighten on the trigger, saw Celine's eyes widen with terror, saw the spillway churning below, waiting to swallow her whole. And he moved. He grabbed the shovel leaning against a timber brace and hurled it with all his strength. The blade spun end over end and struck Mercer's knee with a sickening crack. Mercer screamed and stumbled, releasing Celine. She drove her elbow into his throat, and he went down hard, gasping and clutching his neck. But Glass-Eyed Joe was still there, his rifle swinging toward Wakiza. The shot boomed like thunder, and Wakiza felt fire tear across his ribs as the bullet grazed him. He charged anyway, closing the distance, before Joe could lever another round, and they collided in a tangle of limbs. They rolled through the mud, trading desperate, brutal blows. Joe was bigger, stronger, and he drove his knee into Wakiza's already wounded ribs. Pain exploded through Wakiza's chest, white-hot and blinding. His vision grayed at the edges, and for a terrible moment, he thought he was going to pass out. But then he heard Celine scream his name, heard the fear and desperation in her voice, and something in him roared to life. He wasn't going to die here. He wasn't going to leave her alone to face these monsters. He got his hands on Joe's rifle, wrenched it away, and drove the stock into the man's face. Once, twice. Joe went limp, blood streaming from his broken nose. Wakiza staggered to his feet, clutching his ribs, and turned to find Celine. She was locked in a desperate struggle with Mercer, who'd recovered enough to grab her again. They were perilously close to the spillway edge, and Mercer was forcing her backward inch by inch toward the churning water below. "Celine!" Wakiza shouted, but his voice was weak, his lungs burning. Then Mercer shoved her. Hard. She fell. The world stopped. Wakiza saw her arms windmill, saw her body tilt backward over the edge, saw the terror in her eyes. And without thought, without hesitation, he launched himself forward. He caught her wrist just as she went over his fingers, locking around hers in a grip that was part desperation, part prayer. The momentum carried them both over the edge, but Wakiza's other hand found a timber brace jutting from the dam face, and he held on with strength born of pure will. They hung there, suspended over churning water, Wakiza's arms screaming in protest, his wounded ribs sending bolts of agony through his body with every breath. Below, the water roared, waiting to drag them down and smash them against the rocks. "I've got you," Wakiza gasped. "I've got you, don't let go." "Wakiza." Celine's voice was thin with terror. "I'm slipping." "No, hold on, just hold on." Above them, Mercer appeared at the edge, his face twisted with savage satisfaction. He raised his revolver, aiming down at them. "Say goodbye, savage." The shot never came. Instead, there was a tremendous roar, a sound like the earth itself splitting open. The timber brace Wakiza clung to shuddered violently. Then, with a crack like thunder, the dam began to collapse. The cut fuses, the moved powder kegs, the compromised structure. It had all been leading to this moment, and the dam couldn't hold any more. Water surged through the breach, a wall of it carrying away sandbags and timber and everything in its path. Mercer's eyes went wide with shock, and then the water hit him, sweeping him away in a tumbling mass of debris and foam. The timber brace Wakiza clung to broke free, and suddenly they were falling not into the spillway, but onto a collapsing section of the dam that was sliding down in a controlled avalanche of earth and water. Wakiza pulled Celine close, wrapping his arms around her, trying to shield her body with his as they tumbled down the muddy slope. They hit the bottom hard, rolling through shallow water and mud, before finally coming to rest against a fallen cottonwood. Wakiza's ribs screamed in protest, and his vision swam with pain. But he was alive. They were both alive. Celine coughed and sputtered beside him, covered in mud, but breathing. "Are you hurt?" I'll live." He helped her sit up, and together they watched the dam collapse completely, water roaring back into Storm Creek's natural channel with a sound like victory. Around them, the scene was chaos. Guards were running horses, screaming men shouting as they tried to salvage equipment and flee the flood. Mercer was nowhere to be seen, likely swept downstream or buried under debris. Then Waukeeza saw him. Rusk himself on horseback, riding hard from the direction of Ruby Ridge. The cattle baron's face was flushed with rage, and he had a revolver in his hand. "You've cost me everything," Rusk screamed, spurring his horse directly at them. "Everything." He raised his gun and fired. Waukeeza reacted on instinct. He grabbed the only thing within reach, a broken shovel half buried in mud, and raised it like a shield. The bullet struck the metal blade with a ringing clang, sent the impact jolting through Waukeeza's arms, but the bullet deflecting away. Rusk's horse reared, spooked by the gunfire and the chaos. Rusk fought for control, firing again, but the shot went wild. He was cursing, levering back the hammer for another shot, when a voice rang out across the devastation. "Roman Rusk, drop your weapon." U.S. Marshal Thaddeus Pike sat astride a gray horse on the ridge above, flanked by 6 deputy U.S. Marshals. His badge caught the rising sun, and his face was carved from granite. Rusk's hand wavered. For a moment, Waukeeza thought he might fire anyway, might go down in a blaze of futile violence. But then his shoulders sagged, and the gun fell from his fingers into the mud. It was over. Marshal Pike dismounted slowly, his stiff knee making the descent awkward, and walked down to where Waukeeza and Celine sat exhausted in the mud. He took in the collapsed dam, the scattered powder kegs, the chaos of scattered guards and equipment. "Quite the morning," he observed dryly. "We didn't have a choice," Waukeeza said. "I know, Doctor. Moreau made it to the Echo Canyon relay last night. Transmitted everything: the ledger, the map, the conspiracy. I left Dry River before dawn with every deputy I could muster." He looked at Rusk, now being hauled off his horse and bound by 2 deputies. "Federal charges will be filed within the week. Water theft, bribery, conspiracy to commit forced relocation of native peoples in violation of treaty law. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison." Pike's gaze shifted to Waukeeza. "Your people won't be removed? The railroad deal is dead, and the water rights will be returned to the rightful holders, including your homestead." Waukeeza felt something break open in his chest, relief so profound it was almost painful. "Thank you." Pike nodded, then turned to his deputies. "Round up the rest of Rusk's men. I want statements from everyone." As the lawmen dispersed, Dr. Moreau appeared riding hard from the direction of Echo Canyon. He dismounted and rushed to where Waukeeza and Celine sat, his face a mixture of relief and concern. "You're alive," he said, and it sounded like a prayer of thanksgiving. "Barely," Celine said, but she was smiling. Moreau examined Waukeeza's wounds, the graze on his ribs, the various cuts and bruises, and shook his head. "You need proper medical attention, both of you." "Later," Waukeeza said. He stood slowly, every muscle protesting, and looked out over the valley. Water was flowing freely through Storm Creek again, the morning sun turning it to liquid gold. Small holders were already emerging from their homes, staring in wonder at the returned water. Celine struggled to her feet beside him, and Waukeeza's arm came around her waist, automatically steadying her. She leaned into him, and they stood like that for a long moment, watching the valley come back to life. "We did it," she said softly. "You did it," Waukeeza corrected. "You took the risk. You gathered the evidence. You saved the valley." "We saved it," she insisted. "Together." He looked down at her, this woman who'd walked into his life less than 3 days ago and turned everything upside down. Her face was bruised and mud-streaked, her dress was ruined, her ankle was still splinted. But her eyes were bright and fierce and beautiful, and when she looked at him, he saw his own feelings reflected back. "What happens now?" he asked. She smiled. "We rebuild, we heal, and we figure out what comes next. Together." Together, she promised and reached up to kiss him. This time it wasn't desperate or fleeting. It was slow and sure, a promise made in daylight, with witnesses all around. And Waukeeza felt his heart, his battered, scarred, carefully guarded heart, finally fully open. When they pulled apart, Moreau was watching with an expression that might have been amusement or satisfaction, or both. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you two back to the clinic. You've earned some rest." The weeks that followed were a blur of rebuilding and recovery. Marshal Pike oversaw Rusk's arrest and trial, which concluded with a conviction on all charges. Mercer's body was found downstream, caught in a tangle of debris, dead from drowning and blunt force trauma. Glass-Eyed Joe and several other hired guns turned state's evidence in exchange for lighter sentences, and Deputy Frank was stripped of his badge and run out of the territory. The water rights were formally restored, and Storm Creek flowed freely through the valley. Smallholders returned to their land with renewed hope, and the railroad deal with Steel Mountain was permanently canceled. Waukeeza's homestead was rebuilt with help from Henrik Moreau and dozens of others, including several Cheyenne families who'd heard what had happened and came to lend their hands. The new cabin was stronger than the old one, its walls straight and true, its roof tight against the coming winter. Celine continued teaching at the Prairie Dawn schoolhouse. But twice a week, she rode out to Waukeeza's cabin to teach the Cheyenne children who lived too far from town. She brought books and slates, and Waukeeza built benches on his porch where the children could sit and learn. Their relationship deepened, slowly, carefully built on the foundation of shared hardship and mutual respect. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic gestures, just quiet moments, his hand finding hers, as they sat by the creek at sunset, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the stars emerge the way he always made sure there was coffee waiting when she arrived for her teaching days. One evening, as autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Celine arrived to find Waukeeza building a second structure near the cabin, a small addition with its own door and window. "What's this?" she asked. "A room," he said simply. "For you, if you want it." She was quiet for a long moment, studying the careful construction, the way he'd positioned it to catch the morning light. "Are you asking me to stay?" "I'm asking you to have a choice. A place that's yours if you want it. No obligations, no expectations, just..." He trailed off, struggling for words. "Just a place to be. With me. If that's something you want." Celine set down the books she'd been carrying and walked to him. She took his hands, rough and calloused from weeks of building, and held them between her own. "I don't need my own room," she said quietly. "I need to know that you want me here. Not just as a teacher, not just as an ally, but as someone you're building a life with." Waukeeza's throat tightened. "I've never done this before. Built a life with someone. I don't know if I'll be good at it." "Neither do I, but I'd like to try." She smiled. "If you're willing." "I'm willing," he said, and pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her in a hold that was both protective and vulnerable. "More than willing." She tilted her head up, and he kissed her long and deep and full of promise. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. "So," she said, "one room or two?" "One," he decided, "but bigger, with space for books, and a proper desk for grading papers, and a second chair by the fire." They laughed together, and it was the sound of two people who'd survived the worst and found something precious on the other side. Not perfect, not easy, but real and worth fighting for. Winter came to the valley, and with it peace. The rebuilt cabin stood strong against the wind, and snow smoke rising from its chimney in a steady plume. Inside warmth and light. Books on shelves, slates and chalk scattered across a desk where Celine prepared lessons. Two chairs by the fire where Wakiza and Celine sat in comfortable silence, his hand holding hers, her head resting on his shoulder. The creek flowed beneath its winter ice, waiting for spring. The valley slept and healed and dreamed of the planting season to come. One evening, as snow fell soft and silent outside, Celine looked up from the book she'd been reading and studied Wakiza's profile in the firelight. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I was thinking that this is the first winter I haven't spent alone in more years than I can count, and that it's strange how quickly strange things become necessary. Is that your way of saying you're glad I stayed?" "That's my way of saying I can't imagine this without you anymore. The cabin, the land, the future. None of it makes sense without you in it." Her eyes grew bright with emotion. "That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me." "Is it romantic? I thought it was just true." "It can be both." He turned to look at her fully, his hand coming up to cup her face. "I love you." He said the words simple and unadorned. "I don't know when it happened. Maybe in the creek when I first found you. Maybe when you refused to quit even though every step hurt. Maybe in the storm when I thought I was going to lose you. But it happened, and now I don't know how to unfeel it." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "Good, because I love you too, and I don't want you to unfeel anything." He kissed her then, slow and tender, and outside the snow fell, and the wind sang, and the world turned on, indifferent to human joy, but unable to diminish it. They'd started as strangers thrown together by violence and necessity. They'd become allies, then partners, then something deeper, something that had no easy name, but felt like home. And in the valley where Wakiza had once returned to find everything burned and broken, life had taken root again, stronger, more resilient, built on the ashes of what was lost, but growing towards something new and beautiful. The warrior had found his home, not just in the land, but in the woman who'd walked into his life when he needed her most and stayed when he learned to need her always. Together, they'd fought for justice. Together, they'd rebuilt what had been destroyed. Together, they'd learned that survival was only the beginning, that what came after the slow and careful building of a life worth living was the real victory. And as winter settled over the valley and the fire burned low, Wakiza and Celine sat together in their home, holding each other close and dreamed of spring.